Back in 1996, this was the question. Was Nintendo 64 going to be successful? Was it going to be able to top PlayStation? Well, only you could answer that. The fan, the gamer. What do you think? Was PlayStation better? Nintendo 64? Because we know what happened to Sega Saturn. Well, before Nintendo 64 came out, I was so excited because I played Killer Instinct like hell back then. And in the arcade, of course. And if you remember Killer Instinct in the beginning, before you put your quarters in and everything, the logo of Nintendo Ultra 64 would come up. And you knew one day you're going to get to play Killer Instinct at home. And as a kid, you don't know how excited I was. I was like, man, Killer Instinct, that was one of my favorite games. And eventually, Ultra 64 changed to Nintendo 64. And whatever, name change, okay. And then we got Super Mario 64. Playing Mario in full 3D for the very first time. And critics said it was one of the best games ever made. And other than that, the gameplay is phenomenal. You can go back to it now. Almost, was it 10 years later? Oh, man, it's been 12 years later. Man, 12 years later, and that game is still outstanding. Other than that, it was just awesome. And I just loved Nintendo 64. I got Killer Instinct, but it wasn't the one I wanted. It was Killer Instinct Gold. Well, this is basically Killer Instinct 2 with a different name, and they had kind of other features in it too, where I guess the characters can turn gold. I don't know, but I enjoyed it. It just, the graphics weren't as good as the arcade, and in a way, seriously, I was disappointed. I got to buy Killer Instinct for Super Nintendo, but of course that was the graphics and stuff were anyway. Whatever, I was enjoying my Super Mario 64, my Killer Instinct Gold, and I think I bought NBA Hang Time. But at the time I was subscribed to many magazines, Game Pro, and this one in particular called Next Generation. Next Generation came out with this issue called Something is Wrong with Nintendo 64. Something is wrong with Nintendo 64? Seriously? Seriously. That's what I thought when I opened this magazine. And I had to read this article because this magazine was pissing me off at that time, because every time I opened a page, it was all about Sony, PlayStation, PlayStation. And it's like, I'm not subscribing to this magazine to read about PlayStation games, okay? Where's all the Nintendo stuff? So now they have this whole article about everything that's wrong with Nintendo 64, and how Super Mario 64 and Wave Race can't be the only good games on the system. They had some pretty good arguments at the time, and they actually had 5 in particular, which I'm going to let you know right now, because I saved this magazine. This is a May 1997 issue. I saved this magazine because it really pissed me off that much. Number 1 was out of date. Now, the games are out of date, it was saying. Now, what they were saying was, back then, PlayStation had games like Soul Calibur, okay? And when Nintendo 64 came out, I mean, this is where, looking back, I agree with this now. Killer Instinct 2 at the time, when Nintendo 64 came out, was old already. It was maybe like a year or two old. Cruisin' USA, NBA Hang Time. These were games that were so outdated by the time they got to Nintendo 64. People were like, well, we played these games years ago. We don't want to play them again. So, I agree. I do agree with that one. But here, let's go to number 2. It's too safe. And what they mean by Nintendo 64 was too safe, that it was releasing games that's already been released before. Now, they had Shadows of the Empire back then, and they were saying, well, that game was made because, okay, there's a Star Wars audience, so let's make a Star Wars game. And then they kind of caught on that Pilot Wing 64 was remade, and they knew Star Fox was going to be remade. Basically, all of Nintendo's big franchises were going to be remade, and they were saying that Nintendo was too scared. I disagree at that part, because these games were remade because the fans love them. Now, I want to play a new Star Fox. I want to play a new Mario. I always want to play a new Zelda. I mean, everyone was waiting for the Zelda game. So, I disagree here. Let's go to number 3. Now you're going to agree with this. This, yes, was wrong with Nintendo 64 cartridge. Why did they choose cartridge? I don't know. Yes, as a fanboy, Nintendo fanboy, when I was a kid, hey, whatever. I don't have any loading times. In a way that it didn't even matter. Seriously, the games were almost $60. Seriously, I remember when I bought. I think it's when I bought NBA Hang Time, and that game was not worth this at the time. $59.99. Oh, it just kills me right now saying that again. $59.99, and I think my grandma bought it for me. I think we went to the store and bought it. Oh, sorry, Grandma. $59.99 for NBA Hang Time. Yeah, the games were expensive, and I don't know what Nintendo was thinking, but cartridge based, yeah, no good. Still a magazine. This whole thing was 64-bit and 32-bit. This is number 4 now. They were saying that the Nintendo 64's graphics were kind of blurred, and because Nintendo 64 tried to make the graphics better by blurring the edges of the polygons to make it look smoother. It just didn't really turn out right. And if you play games like Turok, the first one, it would block out a lot of the background, and still finally when you would move forward in the game, you would see the background come forth. And this was all fixed later in the second one, but there were a lot of games that were like that on Nintendo 64 where everything was so blurred that you couldn't really see it, or it would blur up if it was close up, and the graphics did look pretty crappy at those times. And we're gonna go to number 5. And this is when number 5 is pretty important because it's no third-party support. Now, funny thing is, ever since this happened, Nintendo's had always had a problem. Nintendo always had a problem with getting third-party support, especially on GameCube, and now on Wii. I think it's kind of catching back on with Wii, but GameCube had a big problem with third-party support because no one wanted to make games for GameCube. PlayStation. This is why PlayStation won in that battle, because it had huge third party support. And yes, Nintendo 64 did come out with their games and everything, but looking back now, having this magazine in my hand after all these years, I can tell you something honestly. And I hope some of you agree with this. Seriously. Nothing was wrong with Nintendo 64. Nothing. Well, maybe not. But still, my Nintendo 64, I love. And I really think there is not anything wrong with it. If anything, I'm more disappointed with the GameCube. Seriously. Now, if you think about it, the Nintendo 64 has 2 of the best games ever made, Super Mario 64 and The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. And I believe so, to this day, that they still are that good. It introduced us to the Rumble Pack. You stick this baby in the back of your controller and you can feel the game. And ever since then, controllers had a rumble feature. The Nintendo 64 introduced the camera into video games with Super Mario 64. We never had a camera, but because the Lakitu had a camera, follow Mario around, that's what we've always called it. Have you ever thought about that? We have GoldenEye 007, which redefined the first-person shooter. Perfect Dark, a great unofficial sequel to that game. Banjo-Kazooie was a great platformer to follow up Super Mario 64. We were introduced to the Paper Mario series. We were introduced to Super Smash Bros., which all of you right now who have a Wii are playing Super Smash Bros. Brawl to death. We owe a lot to a Nintendo 64. We owe a lot to it. And, I'm not really happy with the GameCube and what happened with it. I'm glad its games will live on the Wii. But, Nintendo 64 deserves a lot of credit. What do you think? Do you like Nintendo 64 better than GameCube? Do you still play it? Do you even have one? Do you want to buy one? Let me know in the comments. Let me know. Video respond. Seriously. I think the little guy needs a little more credit.